They say a man understands the true weight of his life only when he can no longer speak for himself. I did not believe that when I was alive. I believed understanding came in moments, arguments, failures, small victories, quiet apologies whispered into pillows. I was wrong. Understanding came later, when my name was spoken in a room where I could no longer answer, when people stood around a wooden box and told versions of my life that did not match the one I remembered living. There was a sound at my funeral that stayed with me, even though I was already gone. It was not crying. It was silence, the kind that arrives when people realize they have misjudged something beyond repair. A silence that does not comfort, does not heal, but settles heavy in the chest, asking questions no one prepared answers for. I did not hear apologies then. I heard breathing, long pauses, throats tightening, the sound of truth arriving too late. If I had known that this would be the end, not the illness, not the coffin, but that silence, I might have lived differently. Or maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe some lives are built in such a way that understanding can only arrive after everything useful has already been spent. I was not born into poverty. That is the first misunderstanding people make. Poverty is not always a starting point. Sometimes it is a destination you reach slowly, step by step, through choices that seem reasonable at the time. I grew up in a modest neighborhood on the edge of a growing city. The houses were close enough that you could hear your neighbors' radios through the walls, and the roads were always half finished, dusty in the dry season and thick with mud when it rained. My father worked for the local council, not an important man, but a dependable one. He woke before sunrise every day, polished his shoes carefully, and left without complaint. My mother sold vegetables in the market, her hands always smelling of tomatoes and onions, her voice hoarse from calling out prices over the noise. We did not have much, but we had predictability. Meals came at the same time each day. School fees were paid late, but paid. When something broke, it stayed broken until my father found a way to fix it himself. I learned early that dignity did not come from abundance. It came from endurance. I was not a gifted child. I did well enough in school, nothing extraordinary. Teachers described me as quiet, reliable, serious for his age. I did not dream loudly. I did not imagine greatness. I imagined stability. A job that paid on time. A house where the roof did not leak. A family that ate together in the evening. When I met my wife, I thought I had found someone who wanted the same simple things. Her name was Abeni. She was not from my neighborhood. She grew up closer to the city center, where the roads were paved and streetlights worked most nights. Her father owned a small electronics shop, nothing grand, but enough to give her a different posture toward the world. She walked as if things would eventually work out for her. She spoke as if disappointment was temporary, an inconvenience rather than a condition. We met through a mutual friend at a wedding. I remember noticing her laugh first. Not loud, but sharp, confident, the kind that suggested she was used to being listened to. We spoke briefly that day, about nothing important. Where we worked, how far we had traveled, the usual polite exchanges. But something in her attention stayed with me. She looked directly at me when I spoke. She did not interrupt. When we began seeing each other, I was honest about my situation. I worked as a junior accounts clerk at a logistics company. The pay was modest. There was no family land waiting for me, no inheritance, no uncle abroad sending money. She listened, nodded, said she understood. She said money could be built together. I believed her. The early years of our marriage were quiet in a good way. We rented a small flat, one bedroom, thin walls, a kitchen that smelled constantly of damp wood. We bought second-hand furniture. We argued occasionally, mostly about small things, where to store things, how often to visit relatives, whose turn it was to fetch water when the taps ran dry. Nothing felt dangerous. I noticed changes slowly. They did not arrive as insults at first. They arrived as comparisons. Her friends were doing better. One husband bought a car. Another moved his family to a better neighborhood. Abeni would mention these things casually, as if sharing news, but there was an edge to it, a quiet measuring. She started dressing differently, more carefully. She spent longer on her phone. She followed lifestyle pages, watched videos about successful women, about not settling. I supported her ambitions. When she said she wanted to start a small clothing business, I gave her my savings. When she wanted to take short courses, I adjusted our budget. My job did not grow. I worked harder, took on extra responsibilities, stayed late. Promotions came slowly, often passed to younger men with better connections. Each year my salary increased slightly, but never enough to catch up to the cost of living. I noticed Abeni's patience thinning, not in outbursts, but in tone. "You're a good man," she would say, "but goodness alone doesn't pay bills." The first time she mocked me, I did not recognize it as mockery. We were at a small gathering at her cousin's house. Someone joked about men who were afraid of risk. Abeni laughed and said, "Some men are comfortable being small forever." She glanced at me briefly, just long enough for others to notice. My face burned, but I smiled. I told myself it was harmless. Mockery, I learned, often wears a friendly face. At home, her words became sharper. If the electricity was cut, it was my fault. If plans were delayed, it was because I was too cautious. She stopped asking my opinion on decisions. She informed me instead. She began correcting me in front of others, laughing afterward as if to soften the blow. "You wouldn't understand," she would say. "You've never had options." I stopped responding. Silence became my defense. I focused on routine. Wake up, work, return home, eat, sleep, repeat. I believed endurance could fix what conversation no longer could. When her business failed, not dramatically but quietly, through slow losses and unpaid debts, she blamed me. She said I did not support her enough, that my lack of ambition infected everything around me. I accepted the blame without argument. It was easier than fighting. The mocking grew bolder. She joked about my shoes, my phone, my job title. Sometimes she did it in public, sometimes at home when she was tired. She said I was lucky she stayed, that other women would not tolerate a man like me. I nodded. I absorbed it. I told myself marriage required patience. What I did not know then was that patience, when unshared, becomes permission. I began to feel smaller inside my own life. I avoided inviting friends over. I spoke less. I stopped dreaming altogether. When I looked at Abeni, I saw disappointment hardening into something else, not hatred, but contempt. And contempt, I would later understand, does not need anger to destroy a home. My health began to fail quietly. Headaches that lingered, fatigue that sleep did not fix. I ignored it. Doctor visits cost money. Time off work risked my position. I told myself it was stress. The day I collapsed at work, my supervisor drove me to the hospital himself. Tests were done. Words were spoken carefully. I had been sick for longer than I realized. Treatment was possible, but expensive. Very expensive. When I told Abeni, she did not cry. She asked about the cost first. I watched something shift in her eyes then. Calculation, fear, something colder. She asked who would pay. I said we would find a way. She sighed heavily, as if burdened by my weakness. Over the next months, she visited less. She complained about hospital smells, about wasted time. She mocked my condition lightly at first, calling me fragile, telling friends I had become too expensive to maintain. I heard these things. Sometimes she said them where she thought I could not hear. I did not die dramatically. I faded. And when I finally did die, it was quietly, in a hospital bed that smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. But death, it turns out, was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of hers. They said I passed in the early hours of the morning, just before the call to prayer echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the hospital walls. A nurse covered my face. A doctor signed a form. Another bed was prepared. Life moved forward with the efficiency it always does when one ordinary man leaves it. Abeni was informed by phone. She did not come immediately. She said later that she was in shock, that she needed time to process. By the time she arrived, my body had already been transferred to the mortuary. She stood there briefly, arms folded, eyes dry. She asked about paperwork, about costs, about who would handle arrangements. Word spread slowly. I had not been a loud man in life, so my death did not travel loudly either. A few colleagues, some distant relatives, neighbors who remembered me as the quiet husband who greeted politely and kept to himself. What Abeni did not know, what no one knew, was that silence had been my way of building something unseen. Years earlier, when the mocking had begun to settle into routine, I had started making small decisions without announcement. Not acts of revenge, acts of self-preservation. I had taken a second modest insurance policy when my health was still intact. I had joined a cooperative savings group at work, contributing quietly each month. I had kept records carefully, even when Abeni dismissed my attention to detail as small-mindedness. I had updated my will after my diagnosis with the help of a legal aid clinic that offered services to workers like me. I did not do these things to surprise anyone. I did them because control over something, anything, felt necessary. The funeral was held 3 days later. Nothing elaborate. A rented tent, plastic chairs arranged in uneven rows, a simple coffin, a photograph of me that Abeni chose reluctantly, one from years before illness had softened my face and bent my shoulders. People came, not in crowds but steadily. A former supervisor spoke about my reliability. A colleague mentioned how I trained him patiently when he first joined the company. A neighbor spoke about how I fixed her leaking tap without asking for payment. These were not grand stories. They were small, ordinary testimonies. But as they accumulated, something shifted in the air. Abeni sat in the front row, stiff, composed. At first, she listened politely. Then her posture changed. Her arms loosened. Her gaze dropped. Each story seemed to add weight she had not prepared to carry. Then a woman stood, older, confident, unfamiliar to most. She introduced herself as a representative of the cooperative. She spoke clearly, without drama. She explained my contributions, the years of consistency, the benefits now payable to my estate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Next came a lawyer, young, nervous, holding a file too thick for a man who was supposedly poor. He spoke carefully, formally. He mentioned assets, accounts, policies. He mentioned that arrangements had already been made to cover funeral costs fully. Abeni's face tightened. Finally, my letter was read. Not long, not emotional, just honest. I wrote that I loved her once, deeply, that I understood disappointment, but not cruelty, that I hoped she would one day measure people differently, that what remained was not punishment, but truth. The silence that followed was the one I had heard, the one that did not heal. After the funeral, people lingered. Conversations changed tone. Abeni felt eyes on her, curious, restrained, judging without accusation. She left early. In the weeks that followed, reality settled slowly. The money arrived, as paperwork always does, without ceremony. Abeni paid debts she had hidden. She upgraded nothing. The house felt larger without my quiet presence. The silence there was sharper. She replayed memories she had dismissed before. My routines, my restraint, my calm responses to her barbs. She remembered mocking my caution, my lack of risk. She began to understand that what she called smallness had been discipline. What she called fear had been foresight. Neighbors treated her differently now, politely, but with distance, pity mixed with something else. She tried dating again. Men noticed the money first. They noticed less when it was gone. Conversations felt shallow, promises felt rehearsed. She found herself missing something she could not name. Steadiness, perhaps, or being known without performance. Years passed. Abeni aged faster than she expected. Life did not mock her, but it did not forgive either. She worked, she managed, she survived. But the sharp confidence she once carried dulled into caution. Sometimes she visited my grave. Not often, just enough to remind herself it existed. She never spoke aloud. She stood, arms folded as she always had, staring at my name etched into stone. And in those moments, I believe she understood, not loudly, not dramatically, but fully, that poverty is not always empty pockets, that wealth is not always visible, that mockery costs more than patience, and that some funerals do not end lives, they reveal them. My life did not change the world. It did not inspire movements. It did not break cycles loudly. But in one quiet heart, it changed something irreversible. And that, for an ordinary man like me, was enough.